welcome to our seventh AI seminar. Tonight we have a seminar about artificial intelligence in classical and quantum photonics. The presentation is by Federico Vernuccio, who is postdoc researcher at the Department of Physics, and Dario Polli, who is associate professor at the same department.
Okay, so thank you for the kind introduction. As you said, I'm Federico Vernuccio, and today I will talk to you about our recent work on, a review that sum up the main works that have been done that connect artificial intelligence with classical and quantum photonics. So just to start with the presentation, I would like to, give you some brief introduction about what is artificial intelligence, what is photonics. So let's say artificial intelligence can be defined as the science that studies the artificial systems or machines and that imitate the human intelligent behavior. Actually, there is not a unique definition of artificial intelligence, but the majority of the experts agree in this definition, while on the other hand, also photonics is not so easy to be defined, but we can say it's the science that deals with the generation, detection, and manipulation of light in the form of photons. So today I will talk about the link between these two big words. That is the fact that on the one hand, artificial intelligence can be used to boost photonics and to solve complex linear and nonlinear photonic processes, while on the other hand, photonics can pave the way for a new class of platforms accelerating AI tasks. And let's start from, let's say, one of the main branches of artificial intelligence that has gained attention in the past decades has been machine learning. And machine learning, let's say, can be classified according to the way that it derives some information from the data. And so we can distinguish, according to the availability of the data we have, the three different classes of machine learning: supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning. So let's start from the easiest one, which is unsupervised learning, not the easiest, let's say, but the unsupervised learning is the branch of machine learning that deals with the unlabeled data. And that is want to extrapolate some patterns from the unlabeled data. Then we have supervised learning that deals with the data that are provided to the machine in the form of input and output pairs. And so it will try to approximate the function that maps the input to the output. And in the end, we have reinforcement learning, which is quite different with respect to supervised learning or unsupervised learning, because it deals with all that models that want to create a control law in order to, let's say, find a function that can control a system obtaining a particular objective at the end. And so let's start, let's say, from the main fundamentals of machine learning, which are the neural networks. So a neural network is a mathematical object that approximates a nonlinear complex function going from an input layer to the output layer through an hidden layer. So the main elementary units of the hidden layer are called neurons, and each neuron computes a linear combination of the input, so and then another bias, and then activate the output, which is in this case AJ, by a nonlinear function applied to this linear combination. And so in the end, if we apply a nonlinear function such as sigmoid or the hyperbolic tangent of the ReLU function, we obtain the output. Of course, so at the basis of neural networks, there is the universal approximation theorem that establishes that given enough neurons in the hidden layer, it is possible to approximate complex function. But if the function to be approximated is rather complex, we can think of stacking many hidden layers, thus reaching a deep architecture. And so we talk about the deep neural network. And among the neural network that we can talk about, one of the most important are the convolutional neural networks that combines actually some layers, which are the fully connected layers, as the one that I showed you before, where each neuron is connected to the input neurons and to the output neurons, but also other layers, which are the convolutional layers. These are a new kind of layers that actually have two peculiarities. On the one hand, each neuron in a convolutional layer is not connected to all the neurons of the previous layer, but just to a subset, which are of the neighboring neurons. And then another characteristic is that all the neurons, let's say, share the same weights, and the set of the weights that are used to compute, let's say, the output are, let's say, called filter or kernels, but each convolutional layer is constituted by, can be constituted by many filters or many kernels. And so in the end, one of the most, let's say, one of the most famous convolutional neural networks, and also one of the first ones that has been used for imaging application, is the LayNet architecture that starts where we provide the input, let's say, an image, and then by a stack of many convolutional layers, we extrapolate the so-called feature maps. Indeed, we reduce the dimensionality of the image, but we increase the channels, and all these channels are the so-called feature maps. And then at the end, this network is constituted by these layers here, which are the fully connected layers constituted by many neurons that will output the desired, let's say, value that we want to output with the layer. And so one of the most famous convolutional networks that have been used for image analysis are in the form of encoder-decoder network. And so these are some examples of encoder-decoder architectures. And in particular, these architectures are constituted by two parts. The first part, which is the encoder, that from the images it extrapolates the feature maps and reduces the dimensionality. And then there is the decoder that restores the initial dimensionality by, let's say, looking at the feature maps that have been encoded by the first part of the convolutional neural network. And in this kind of neural networks, there are some special connections that, let's say, provide the output of a given layer to the layer of the decoder, and these connections are called concatenations, and this helps the network to restore the initial image and to learn faster, let's say, to learn faster the function that has to be approximated. So one of the most important network that when we do convolutional network is the U-net that has this shape of a U architecture, where we have the first part, which is the encoder, and then we have the decoder, and there are these concatenation between the encoder and the decoder. And other type of convolutional neural networks that can be used in, let's say, for imaging tasks, and that we will see then some application that uses all these networks, are the recurrent neural networks. So these are a new kind of, let's say, architectures in which the output of a given layer, in this case, this output here, it depends not just by the input of the layer, but also by all the previous elements of the network. And so it is said that this kind of neural networks have, let's say, a sort of memory. Indeed, the most common recurrent neural networks are the so-called low short-term memory networks that introduced for the first time the concept of memory cells to store the information that well, let's say, to store information and also to preserve portion of the internal state of the network. And to go on, so let's say at the moment, so once we have seen, let's say, the panorama of all the possible methods that are useful to understand the next application that I will show you, I would like to start with some application on artificial intelligence to spectroscopy, and in particular, why spectroscopy? Because it's like our main interest since we are at the physics department, and in our group we work mainly with Raman spectroscopy or coherent Raman spectroscopy and also nonlinear microscopy. So I will start by a brief introduction of the topic to understand then the applications, and in particular, let's say, among the spectroscopic techniques, vibrational spectroscopy has gained attention because it, it helps, let's say, reconstructing the chemical information of the sample by looking at the spectra like this, which are the so-called vibrational spectra, that in every, so each element of a sample can be characterized by a vibrational spectrum that could be divided into three main regions: the fingerprint region, which is the one that contains a higher number of peaks, the silent region where no peaks are present, and then the CA stretchy region where there are very strong peaks but not so many, and they are very broad and so less chemically selected. And if we look at the fingerprint region, and we have a zoom on the fingerprint region, we see that all these peaks can be associated to different chemical bonds in the molecules. And let's say the most common technique to investigate and to collect this kind of vibrational spectra is spontaneous Raman, a label-free technique that exploits a laser, typically a monochromatic or quasi-monochromatic laser beam with a given input power omega pump. And when there is an interaction with the sample and the laser, of this laser with the sample, there will be a spontaneously emitted Stokes component that carries the vibrational information. And so what we see is that we can read this spectrum here. The problem is that the spontaneous Raman has a very low scattering cross-section, and so it means that for acquiring a single spectrum, it can take from 100 milliseconds to 1 second, especially for biological application, and hours for imaging. And if we want to look and to understand better which is the difference between, let's say, this technique and the one I will talk to you about in a few moments, in a few seconds, let's start from this scheme here, in which in spontaneous Raman we somehow send a laser beam, which is in this case a CW laser beam. It illuminates the sample, and so the molecules will start vibrating. And what we read is a given vibration associated to that molecule. While there is another possibility in order to go fast is to use a coherent, approach. So we talk about coherent Raman, in which we, instead of using CW laser, we use pulses, but we now use this instead of a single beam, two beams, so a pump beam and a Stokes beam, and we can look at the vibration. But you now see that we can probe all the vibration, but that will now vibrate coherently. And so, on the one hand, we can just see, so we can see the same signal, so the signal that correspond to the frequency shift between the two beams, so the pump and the Stokes beam. But the advantage is now that we can have a signal enhancement thanks to the coherent excitation. The problem is that while for spontaneous Raman we can acquire many vibrational peaks, for the coherent Raman we can just look at a single vibration at a time in this configuration. And if we want to look, let's say, at the same diagram we saw before, when we talk about coherent Raman scattering, we have the two laser beam, and the interaction with the sample will lead to the generation of some signals which are called stimulated Raman signals that arises on top of the original beams as a gain in correspondence of this beam here in red, which is the Stokes beam, or as a loss in correspondence of this green, let's say, this green peak here, which is the pump beam, or it can be read as a new signal arising in a new region of the spectrum, which is the adiabatic Stokes component, which is called S-cast. And this process is mediated, being a non-linear process, is mediated by the third order vibrational susceptibility here, which describes the properties of the samples in terms of a resonant term and a non-resonant term. So, if we look at these signals, in particular, we can distinguish some things about the SRS signal, the car signal, but I don't want to go into many details. We can say that if we look at the car signal, the problem is that it is scaled quadratically with this vibrational susceptibility, and so while on the one hand it is easy to be detected since it arises in a new region of the spectrum, and so it is well separated with respect to the Stokes found beam, and so it is easier to detect it since it does not require any modulation transfer techniques that are needed instead for the SRS process. In this case, the car signal suffers from the presence of the non-resonant background that I will explain you in a few moments. So the alternative, of course, as I told you before, this technique, which is Fourier Raman scattering, allows just to have one single frequency, but one can couple a narrowband beam, which is a narrowband pan beam, with a broadband Stokes beam, and in this case detect a broadband signal, so read many vibrations, as, for example, in this case, as a gain in correspondence of the Stokes beam, or as a broadband anti-Stokes component for the Cars beam. For example, I can talk about this experimental setup that we realized in our lab, in which we combined the narrowband beam with a broadband Stokes beam that we can obtain with a technique which is called supercontinuum generation in a crystal, and with very high energetic passes we can generate a broadband Stokes beam, and after these two beams are generated, we can then combine them and send them to the, let's say, a macroscopy unit where we insert, in this case, a cuvette with a solvent and detect with a spectrometer the Cars signal by filtering out the original beams, which are the bump and the Stokes, and reading the anti-Stokes component. And these are typical spectra that we can apply with the system. So as you see here, if you compare to the spectra when I talked about spontaneous Raman, this spectra does not look like spontaneous Raman spectra because of the presence of this bell shape that is due to the presence of this non-resonant background. And actually, we want to remove this in order to compare the results we obtain with coherent anti-Stokes Raman scattering with the one with spontaneous Raman. And the origin of this non-resonant background, if we have a closer look to the expression of the cast intensity, is given by this expression here. So since we have both the resonant and the non-resonant term, the cast signal will be characterized by the sum of these two terms, and also an interference term between the real part of the resonant susceptibility and the non-resonant term. And by, let's say, changing, by considering different ratio between the resonant and non-resonant part, we see that on the one end, the non-resonant signal allows amplifying and so reading all the vibrational modes in a faster way. But the other problem is that also it distorts the peak, and so rather than reading this differential peak, we read many peaks which are distorted. So in order to separate it, there are different solutions. In order to remove this non-resonant background, there are different solutions. Experimental solutions that are complex to implement and also degrade the signal, or other methods which are numerical algorithms and well known. But the problem is that these numerical algorithms are non-trivial and also require a priori knowledge on the system. So the main idea is that since we are dealing with a nonlinear complex, with a nonlinear problem, why don't we use neural networks in order to approximate the nonlinear complex function that goes from this Cars data to the Raman-like spectra that resemble the spontaneous one. And indeed, so the function to approximate is the one that I told you before, where you want to extrapolate just this term here, which corresponds to the imaginary part of the chi3 resonant susceptibility. And so we exploit the power of neural networks, and we realized a system where we can that works on simulated data, and this data can be used in order to we can simulate with the, say, just with simulation the car signal, and also we can extrapolate the imaginary part, which resembles the Raman spectrum. And then once we have the input and target, we can train the networks, learning the transfer function between the input and the output. And so these are, for example, some simulated data that, as you see, they look like the data we can acquire. And these are, for example, the cars data. These are the one of the Raman-like data, and these are the non-resonant background simulated by us. And if you look at the network, now we can exploit a network which is similar to the LeNet architecture, where we combine some convolutional layers with the fully connected layers. And so the convolutional layers will recognize the so-called fissure maps. So in this case, in the spectra are the dispersive line shapes, and then the fully connected layers restore the original spectrum, but in the form of Raman-like spectra. And these are the performance of the network when looking at data that have not previously seen by the network. So we see that if we start from simulated data, we have so cars data, we have all this dispersive line shape. This is the real, so the data that the network should predict. And in this sense, the retrieved can recognize all the main peak into the spectrum. And in this case, it can recognize even more peak with respect to the one that have been used for training the network, because we train the network with 15 peaks, but in this case, we have 40 peaks, and we can recognize all of them. So this confirms that the convolutional layers are doing their work in a proper way. And these are other examples instead of experimental data. So the data that I shown you before, now we can read them without the non-resonant background. And here we can also compare these results with the spontaneous Raman 1. And you see that we can recognize all the main peaks, apart from the fact that since these are measured data, there are some artifacts due to noise, since the network is still sensitive to noise, so it needs some improvement. And the reason, and of course, this was one of the first tentative solution of this problem, and now many groups are working. So that we, together with another group, did for the first time, but now many groups are working to try to solve this problem of removal of the non-resonant background. And some solution have been done adopting the so-called recurrent neural networks that I told you before, by reading this scarce data as a sequence of values, and the line distortion are the pattern that are recurring in the data. And other solutions instead have adopted the encoder-decoder architecture, where we have the first part that extrapolates the fissure maps, and then another part to make all made on the convolution layers, which is the decoder, and that restores the previous spectrum. And in this case, the skip connection helped in obtaining the results which performed better than the network, the first network we did. But still, they do not work pretty fine when we go to much more complex spectra. And so we are now working with some collaborators of us in order to improve it and to translate this NRB removal also on imaging application. But let's see now some application of AI to microspectroscopy, and in particular, I will start from a work that another work we did recently, which is, let's say, we used the same cars setup, but in this case we combine the broadband source beam again with a narrow bandpass beam, but we used some, let's say, optical manipulation of the laser beam in order to compress the beam and to have all the colors arriving at the sample at the same time. Since while this was guaranteed in the first case because we used objectives which were not bulky, in this case, since we have very high numerical aperture objectives which are made of many lenses, we have dispersion of the colors at the sample plane. So it means that the colors does not arrive together at the sample because they will see different refractive index. And in this case, we see that we just need to pre-compress the beam in order to have all the colors arriving at the sample. And we then, instead of using just a simple scheme as before for spectroscopy, we need to create a real microscope, and this microscope will detect the signal in an upright configuration, so the laser beam goes from the top to the bottom, and we detect the full work-as signal. And then, of course, this signal goes again into the spectrometer and detects every time we scan the sample, the spectrum which is associated to each point of the image. And in this case, the image we can collect are like this. So we have, instead of having a single spectrum, we have many pixels, and each pixel corresponds to a given spectrum. But when we do imaging, when we go fast, the spectrum will look noisy. And so we need to apply a post-processing pipeline in order to, let's say, reconstruct the chemical information. And in order to do that, we needed to denoise the data, and we did it with the neural network. Then to remove the non-resonant background, and in the end also to, let's say, distinguish the different chemical components with some mixing algorithms, which are called the spectral mixing algorithm. And we read that the denoising task is a machine learning task, exploiting again supervised learning. And in this case, the network is again inspired by the LeNet architecture. So we used a convolutional neural networks that takes as an input the noisy data that we have, and as the output the data which are not noisy, so the ideal output. And so we train the network on many data that in this case are not simulated but collected experimentally. And so we collect the data with a high exposure time in order to not have noise. Then we add the noise manually, and so we generate the input-output pairs. And when we train the network, we see that the network on data that have not been seen by the network can remove the noise. And if we test it on data that have been obtained by 1 millisecond exposure time, we have that with the denoising, we can increase the signal-to-noise ratio by a factor more than 5, which is a result which is even higher with respect to the case where we integrate 100 times more with the spectrometer. And why using neural network for this kind of task and not using other conventional technique for denoising, such as Fourier transforms, or Whiskey-Gole filter, or moving mean? The problem is that when we do cast, we need, then for the NRB removal, we need to preserve the high dispersive line shapes, and which have a high frequency component. And we see here that if we use, let's say, this algorithm here, we cannot preserve the dispersive line shape, and so the output, after we remove the non-resonant background, we obtain a bad estimation of the Raman line spectrum. While with the neural network, we can obtain a good estimation as the one provided by the ground truth, which resembles the spontaneous Raman spectrum, which is here in the top row. So we then, of course, since this was an application, we used this network for spectroscopy, but then we could translate also to microscopy by considering all the spectra of an image. And if we denoise all these spectra, we apply the removal, and then we factorize the image, we can obtain, let's say, if we want to factorize the processed data set in the matrix of concentration and the matrix of the spectra, we can distinguish these three components, which are the three different components in the sample, that are, let's say, bits of plastic bits of polystyrene, polymethyl methacrylate, and the background is like a solvent where these bits are embedded, which is dimethyl sulfoxide that we call here DMSO. And these are the results that, of course, compared with the spontaneous Raman, show very good results. And what we do at the end is just by obtaining these three channels, we combine them and we obtain false color images. But then our goal is just to test also microscopy, also for biological samples. And so, for example, if we consider longitudinal section of Murray spine, this is the H&E image that is used mainly in biology for assessing the morphology of the sample and also the localization of the main structures in the sample. But if we can then go to cast imaging, we image a slice which is adjacent to this one, but which is not stained. And so it means it is not colored. So we took let's say a transparent slice and we image this with our system the same portion, the same sample, and in the end what we get is this cast imaging here, and by this applying the spectral denoise and the NRB removal, we can then obtain fourth color images again using, in this case, unsupervised learning technique such as the K-links cluster analysis that try to let's say clusterize all the pixels that resemble the same spectrum, and so give the output not only this fourth color image but also the mean spectrum associated to each cluster that then we associated, for example, for the red to the bone, for the blue to the muscle, and for the green to the marrow, recognizing all the main peaks in the fingerprint region, which are associated to the different chemical constituents. But machine learning in the literature has not been used just for denoising, but also for recognizing, let's say, the percentage of a certain chemical species when reading the spectra. And so there is this work that has been done where, starting from convolutional layers, it can, let's say, recognize the percentage of a given species in this spectrum here, or it has been used also for imaging. In this case, these were SRS images that were collected in the system, and the network was first trained in data that have been collected with a technique which is called hyperspectral SRS that allows us to see a different time to change, let's say, the wavelength between the bump and stops and see different vibrational modes, reconstructing this hyperspectral data, such as the one I showed you before. But in this case, they use the network, they train the network by summing up all these hyperspectral SRS obtained with these images here, and then they generated also with other algorithms the ground truth, where the different compounds, for example, in this case of the cells, were distinguished, such as lipids, plasmatic reticulum, and nuclei. And so they first trained the network with this data, with this input and output pairs, and then they instead used another technique to collect spectra on the same cells, but they were of course different images, which is this femtosecond SRS. Instead of having all the different channels separated, it collected directly on a single image all the vibrational information without separating the information of the single vibrational mode. And this network here could predict, could reconstruct, let's say, this chemical map without having information about the single channel of the image. Just looking at the integrated image here. That of course in this case, while this is important, because in this case, while this technique takes time because you need to tune the laser and to apply sequential scan, in this case with a single shot image you can obtain this image here, and so in a time which is quite fast with respect to the case where you acquire all these tasks here. And now we move on other application of AI. In this case, we talk about application computational imaging. In particular, when light goes through scattering media, such as objects, it undergoes a different, so many scattering processes and a distortion of the wavefront. And so at the end, if we connect with a camera, the light that comes from, let's say, from the illumination of a given object, what we see at the camera is not a real image, but it's like a speckle pattern. And from this speckle pattern, we can reconstruct the image of the object by using again a neural network. And this is very important when dealing also with multimodal fiber and telecommunication, because you look at the speckled pattern, and from the speckled pattern you can retrieve information of the object. And now other application of AI in photonics have been used also for controlling highly nonlinear optical processes. And in this case, I will talk about the third, let's say, branch of machine learning, which is reinforcement learning. Because as I told you, in our setup, we were generating the broadband light using this complex nonlinear phenomenon, which is the supercontinuum generation in a bulk crystal. And from the practical point of view, what we have to do in the lab is to consider to, let's say, control the power that arrives at this crystal by rotating a plate with that in combination with this other optical, say, device, this other optical component, which is a polarized beam splitter, control the power that arises in the crystal. Then you need also to control the divergence of the beam by closing or opening an iris, and then also to control the position of the crystal in the focal plane. But of course, if from a practical point of view you have just these 3 let's say, object to touch, from a practical point of view, it can take a very long time for a user to switch on the white light and to stabilize it. So the main idea is that why don't we use reinforcement learning to do this very complex problem? And as I told you, reinforcement learning has been used in many fields, in engineering, computer science, neuroscience, mathematics, psychology, economics. But let's say one of the main use of reinforcement learning is that it can be used for Markov decision process solutions. What is a Markov decision process solution? In particular, you can model your system, your control system, as an agent that has to compute some action on the system itself, and then it observes the system and receives from the system the actual state of the system, but also a reward according to the change of the state of the system, but also according to the action that he has done. And in a Markov decision problem, we can distinguish 2 functions. The first function, which is the policy, that regulate, let's say, the action that has to be done by the agent to control the environment. And then this other function, which is called the state action value function, that actually is the function that define the reward of that has to be given to the agent by looking at the action he has done, at the actual state, but at the new state of the system and at the previous state of the system here. And the main goal, of course, of the reinforcement learning is to determine, in this case, an optimal policy that maximizes the reward. But in this case, the agent, as a user, when he has to switch on the white light, has no previous knowledge about the system. So he can just learn by experience. And so the idea is just to control the system by defining the state of the system as considering 3 parameters, so 3 actuators that are at a given position, that are connected to the plate here, this halfway plate, the iris, and then also the position of the crystal, and also defining a reward according to the spectrum, in this case, which is measured from the white light that is generated after the crystal itself. And this reward in this case is defined by considering the spectrometer and processing many spectra for an exposure time of 3 milliseconds. So the neural network in this case is has this form here. So these are fully connected networks that are constituted by an actor and a critic, and this form is well known in reinforcement learning since it is known as twin delayed deep deterministic policy gradient, and in particular the actor has to approximate the policy, which is the function pi, and so given the state of the system has to determine the action, while the critic has to, given the state and the action, to determine this function here, which was the one associated to the reward. And if you look here, the system, when we consider different cases, different acquisition of the spectrum by a spectrometer, we see that if there is no light, the reward is very low. If there's light and also this white light is very broad and it lasts for a few times, the reward will be high. But then if there's light also for a longer time, but in this case, the light is not as broad as we want, the reward will be not so high. And so, of course, there are other possibilities to test, to define the rewards, but this was the one we chose. And we see here that by considering the training, so the training, this graph here resembles how the network is trained. So the first time, of course, I said the agent has to learn by experience. So there is a sampling part where the system, so the whole network, will explore the different state by measuring the different rewards which are here. Then a part of the evaluation, which is a noise-free part where, let's say, without noise, the system evaluates different states and calculates the rewards. And then in the network, there is again in the training of the network, there is an exploration of the system. In this case, the state of the system is perturbed and the reward is calculated. Then again, an evaluation, but it's just only at the third evaluation that after the third exploration, let's say this is the first one, the second, the third one. After the third exploration, the system can, let's say, always have a positive reward by, let's say, changing the state in a noise-free policy. And these are a few examples. So after the agent has been trained, what the system can do is that at the beginning we are, let's say, without any light, so in a random position of the actuator, but then after a few steps, just 5 movements, and not based of say, an operator trying to switching on the white light. After 5 movements, the system can switch on the white light and stabilize it. Of course, as you see here, the network does not go to the white light, which is the broadest one, because maybe the broadest one is not the most stable and the one that lasts forever. But the broader one, and the one that in this case has a higher stability in time, is the one, for example, described by 5, which is not as intense as the one by 2, but it guarantees a good stability of the source. And this is important when doing, let's say, spectroscopy when doing spectroscopy, because one wants to have a very stable source. So I just conclude this this presentation, by introducing to you some application of AI to the other part of the, so the other part of the talk is quantum photonics. In particular, quantum photonics is a science, so every quantum system is a very complex system that can generate a very large amount of data. And of course, machine learning tasks like having many data, a large amount of data, and can handle such amount of data. And the main problem is that a quantum system is very difficult to be modeled. But the idea is that one can use again a reinforcement learning agent in order to try different, let's say, configuration of an optical system, just obtaining the final result. In this case, this application consisted in a given system, in a given laser beam that was prepared with a nonlinear process, which is called here SPDC, spontaneous parametric down conversion. And then in the optical table, we have many optics that, of course, can acquire different state. And when the light goes through this when the photons goes through these optics, of course, the state will be modified, and they will be modified, there will be an even generated state. Then now the agent can look at the state, evaluate the action that he has to do to this state here by moving the different actuators, and then look again at the state and receiving the reward. After the training, so at the end, the reinforcement learning agent can find the best configuration of the setup that give the output to the desired state. But also in quantum optics, AI is being used not only for the generation of quantum states, but also for the metrology and sensing. And in particular, as I told you before, sometimes it is very difficult to develop a model for quantum system, to describe a complex quantum system. And AI can be a solution because it can map a very complex nonlinear function. It doesn't matter which is the model, but if it knows the input and the output, it can understand which is the relation between the input and the output. And in this case, it has been used in order to estimate the phase of light when it goes through, let's say, media. And for this example here, the system was prepared in order to measure, to do different measurements of the state of the system using, here this plate here, which is a plate, which is a halfway plate of a system, and that splits the state, the original light that has been prepared as this state here, which is like a combination of linear states where any photon can couple with the vacuum state. And one can use a few photodiodes, avalanche photodiodes, in order to detect the co-occurrence of the photons at these two photodiodes. And these are, let's say, four different measurements done at different positions of this halfway plate. And the system can be trained by looking at these four measurements, and then at the output by reconstructing the phase phi which was imposed to this state here. But indeed here you see that the network after training can be tested, and on the data that is not to be seen, and you can see how there is a coincidence between the predicted value with respect to the one that is, so this is the predicted and this is the so-called ground truth, so the one that was provided by the network in order to verify if it was correct. So if now instead of imparting to the beam a known phase, you impart a phase which is not known when the light goes into, let's say, scattering media or other sample, you can estimate the phase without knowing, without needing of modeling the system. So I just conclude going fast by saying that in this talk I talk about that on the one hand AI can boost photonics in several applications for spectroscopy, for microscopy, have spectral imaging, in computational imaging, also for nonlinear complex tasks in quantum optics. And on the other hand, the part that I'm not covered in this talk is the fact that also photonics can boost AI, and we can provide AI with photonic platforms that can accelerate and also reduce the computational costs of AI. And this possibility is due to the fact that photons are bosonic particles, and so they are non-interacting with nature, and so they allow us to perform a parallel computation with ultra-broadband bandwidth. So with this, I would like to acknowledge all the people that contributed on realizing this review here that I talked to you about. So Arianna, Valeria, Alessandro, Professor Giulio Celun, and Professor Dario Polli, which is here, and also Carlo Michele that contributed to part of the works that I talked to you so far. And with this, I would like also to show you our group at the physics department. which is the so-called, we are the Vibra group. And I would like to thank you all for the attention, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you for the interesting talk. Is there any question from the audience?
One question related to the model. How do you assure that the model is correct? Did you develop some software? Did you use some available software to verify this?
Oh, okay. So in principle, when you want to design a new model, you mainly start by referring to literature what it has been done for a certain type of task, and then it's like a trial and error in the sense that you have your architecture. Your architecture is made by many layers, but you need to decide the number of the layers, the number of let's say in the convolution layers, you need to decide the number of the filter, the size of the filter, and then once you let's say define the topology of the architecture, you can then also another important part for artificial intelligence is to decide to design perfectly the training dataset, because the training dataset should resemble the data you want then to let's say use for let's say the data that from where you want to predict a given output. Then in order to see if the network is doing proper things, I think that the main question was this. So in order to see if the network is working properly, it's just that you then test the network on data that have not previously seen, but you know which is the output. And in that case, sometimes you keep part of, so from the training data set, which is made of input-output pairs, you keep a part for the training, a part for the validation of the network, which is done during the training, and then another part, a very small subset, you keep for the testing of the network. So you test the network on data that have not previously seen, but from where you have both the input and the output. And so if you see that the network on that test data set works pretty fine, it means that it's doing its job. Okay. Maybe it was not.
Perfect.
Okay.
Absolutely perfect. But in case you have something unexpected, you don't know, your material is new, but something is absolutely unexpected. You are using something that historically, you test with something historically that you know what is the output.
Okay.
But in case of something that you don't know,
Yeah,
the model is not assuring you that it's giving the right result.
Yeah, so in that case, it's like, so it depends on the kind of data you are dealing with. So I can talk about my experience with the spectroscopy, Raman spectroscopy, is then when work with coherent Raman as a reference the spontaneous Raman. So if I now I want to see if the NRB removal networks work pretty fine on predicting, let's say, the spectrum of a given biological sample. I know that there is the spontaneous Raman that I can acquire one spectrum taking it so long and seeing if the peak that my network has predicted, the position of the peak coincides with the, let's say. Then, of course, when we go to quantum, you need to have some reference to try differently to see if of course you need to prove if you don't know anything about the system, uh, you need to prove another way if it is correct or not the output. But it is then an evaluation of the operator. Because of course that is like machine can substitute operators in some tasks, but not all the tasks maybe. Because also
Yes, about the non-personal background remover.
Yeah.
You mentioned at some point in some of these slides that they can be trained very quickly, like in a few minutes.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask, do you mean every single time that you have to do a new experiment, like I have acetone and I have ethanol, do you have to retrain the model every single time you have a new experiment? Maybe you change the sample or something, and if you do, when do you need to retrain the model? Like, is this an advantage because I need to train the model many, many times, or can I just leave the model for a month to train and then I'll be sure that the thing will work for a wide range of applications?
Yeah, so also in this case, I would answer it depends on the network. So in this case, for the NRB removal, since it was trained on synthetic data, if the training dataset covers all the possibility that you can expect from your experiment, you can somehow train the network once and save the weights of the network, and then load every time you need the network without needing to of training it again, and you have so the network will predict correctly, so let's say, or at least apart from some imprecision because of noise, and somehow it will give you the prediction. Then, if in the other sense, if you look at then now instead of this NRB removal on the denoiser, the denoiser worked differently because in that case, if I train the network on data with a high and low signal to noise ratio, but in that case, they were data that you need to show to the network that if you have high and low signal to noise ratio of that type, it can then predict the new data of that type. But if are completely different data, the network has not experience on that, and of course it won't give you a correct prediction. Yeah.
So regarding the first application, you didn't show some metrics, and in particular, I was wondering what is the false positive rate? How it's changed when you go from simulated data to real data?
Sorry, just I didn't get the question. So false
positive rate, like I guess sometimes it can happen. The networks see a peak that is not real.
how do you get that is a false? Okay, so in that case, so if you have too many false negatives, so false peaks that were not there, it means the network is not working properly. And indeed, if you then, for example, on your test dataset, if you compute the loss function to see if it is predicted well or not, the test dataset is saying to you, look, the loss is very high, so it means that you are not reconstructing correctly. Then when you go to experimental data, as I said, you can compare it with some reference, and if it is not working, it means that the network has not seen that kind of data, and so you need to include to the dataset something which is similar to that in order to have a good prediction. Indeed, I think one of the most important, most difficult tasks for machine learning and deep learning is not just designing the architecture and establishing which is the architecture, but also having a very good training dataset that includes all the possibilities that you can encounter during your experiments.
So let's thank our speaker again. As usual, we have our refreshment in the hall of the department. You can reach it by exiting here and re-entering in the main entrance. And you can continue discussing with our speaker there. Thank you.